Early in the morning, firefighter George Tiafe had just finished a tiring 24-hour shift at the fire station. Exhausted but looking forward to spending time with his daughter, he drove to his grandmother's house to pick up 8-year-old Madison. On their way home, Madison suddenly remembered that she had forgotten something important back at her mother's apartment. As they drew closer to the townhouse, a feeling of unease washed over him. His chest grew heavy as he stepped inside. And in that moment, his world fell apart. There, on the living room floor, lay Shauna's. Her face was barely recognizable, bruised, bloodied, and disfigured by unimaginable violence. Shauna Ann Castleton was born on March 13, 1966, in Salt Lake City, Utah, to her loving parents, William and Nancy Castleton. Just 2 years later, in 1980, the Castletons packed up once again and headed further south, this time to Northern Virginia. There, Shauna began a new stage in her education, first in middle school and then in high school. At each new place, Shauna quickly made friends and fell into a comfortable groove, proving that a kind heart and a sunny demeanor can ease even the most dramatic transitions. For someone as enthusiastic, charming, and full of life as Shauna, Las Vegas was the perfect place to call home. So, in 1994, when Shauna was 28, she made the decision to move to this bustling city, a place where there's a rich blend of opportunity, entertainment, and the chance for a fresh start. So it wasn't long before she decided to become a cocktail waitress at a glamorous, newly opened casino on the Strip. She quickly became a favorite with both the customers and her colleagues, who fell under the spell of her kindness, her generous spirit, and her ability to make every guest feel special. About a year after starting her new job, Shauna's path crossed with a man who seemed destined to be a permanent fixture in her life. His name was George Tiafe, a tall, strong man with a fit, athletic build, a warm and charming smile, and a calm confidence that drew Shauna toward him. George was a firefighter with the Las Vegas Fire Department, a man whose calling was to save lives and protect his community. From their very first meeting, a passionate connection blossomed between them, a bond forged by understanding, loyalty, and deep affection. Shauna fell in love with George, and to her, it truly felt as if he was the person she had been waiting for all her life. George was not just physically attractive. He was a man with a kind heart, a strong moral compass, and a generous spirit. Someone who made Shauna feel valued, supported, and appreciated. Just a year after their first meeting, Shauna and George celebrated a momentous event, the birth of their beautiful daughter, Madison. George showered his 2 girls with love and care, and Shauna, now a mother, glowed with happiness and a deep sense of purpose. Because both Shauna and George frequently had to work nights due to their respective schedules, Madison often stayed at her grandmother's home while her parents were busy. When Madison turned 3, in March 2006, George and Shauna decided to make their relationship official by tying the knot in a wedding ceremony filled with love, happiness, and promises for the future. The first few years after their wedding seemed picture perfect, a strong marriage forged by loyalty, understanding, passion, and shared goals. But, unfortunately, happiness is not always destined to last. The financial crisis of 2008 dealt a heavy blow to many families across the country, and George and Shauna were no exception. This dramatic change in their financial situation placed immense stress upon their marriage. George, wrestling with financial pressures and growing worries, began to withdraw, and his demeanor slowly started to transform, turning him into a person less recognizable to Shauna. Once, George crossed a boundary that Shauna could not ignore, a moment that cut deep into their marriage and their ability to trust each other. While Shauna was in the process of getting ready for work, George turned to her and called her a woman of ill repute, and he chose to do this in front of their young daughter, Madison. This moment, in which he openly disrespected her in the presence of their child, left a permanent scar on their family's happiness. In reality, George was wrestling with his own struggles, his growing financial worries, and a growing feeling of inadequacy stemming from the fact that Shauna was now the main breadwinner in their household. This reversal in roles gnawed at his confidence and made him feel less a man in his own home. For this very reason, George began to control how Shauna spent their money, much of which Shauna had earned through her own hard work and diligence. With each new month and year after the financial crisis, these problems only seemed to grow, adding further weight to their struggles. As if in a silent form of protest against his wife's growing independence, George made a decision to befriend a homeless drifter and hired him to do some yard work without even consulting her first. Shona was worried about their safety, especially when this unknown person was frequently on their property while George was away. Often, Shona was home alone with Madison, and the man's presence made her feel vulnerable and unsettled. The growing chaos made her feel powerless and sad, yet Shona kept trying to hold everything together for the sake of their family, until there was no more strength left to endure the growing humiliations. Finally, in April 2012, Shona made a courageous decision to leave. She chose peace and stability for herself and her daughter, trusting that a new future was still possible. Shona was a strong woman, someone who excelled at her job, successfully adapted to a new routine, and made sure that little Madison wanted for nothing. The two of them settled into their new city apartment in suburban Summerlin, Nevada, just 30 minutes away from her workplace. Though Shona had lost her marriage, she still had Madison, the greatest blessing of her life, and a rewarding career to pursue. One evening in early September, after finishing her casino shift as usual, Shona made her way back home. The moment she stepped inside their new residence, a rush of disbelief washed over her. Something was not quite right. It was immediately clear someone had been there in her absence. Surprisingly, it wasn't a typical burglary. None of her valuable belongings were gone, except for her wedding ring, a symbol of promises made and promises broken. Instead, the intruder had left something bizarre in its place: a pair of men's boxer shorts in a small size. At that moment, perhaps due to overwhelm, disbelief, or a lingering hope for normalcy, Shona decided to let it be. A decision that would weigh upon her mind in the months to come. Early on the morning of September 29, 2012, a dramatic chain of events began to unfold. Events that would shock a community and forever alter the lives of those involved. At approximately 3 a.m., surveillance cameras in the casino captured the moment 46-year-old Shona Toffee finished her long overnight shift and walked toward the parking lot. Shona, a devoted mother and a hard-working woman, slipped into her car and began the 30-minute drive back home to suburban Summerlin, a quiet neighborhood where many families chose to raise their children, far away from the chaos of the Las Vegas Strip. Tragically, Shona would not make it safely to her bed that night. Shortly after parking her car in the garage and making her way up toward her townhouse, something awful happened. Shona was attacked right on the stairwell outside her home. The attack was so severe that Shona fell to the floor and was left there, unable to move or call for help. It was not until nearly 6 hours later, at approximately 9 a.m., that Shona's was discovered under dramatic and heartbreaking circumstances. George Toffee, Shona's estranged husband, finished his 24-hour shift at the fire station and then went to his mother's home to pick up their 8-year-old daughter, Madison. The little girl was supposed to spend the day with her father, but just as they were preparing to leave, Madison realized that she had forgotten something at her mother's townhouse, a small but cherished item. So George decided to make a brief stop by Shona's place to retrieve it. As George turned down their street, he noticed from a distance that the garage door was not locked, which seemed unusual. Nevertheless, he and Madison entered the residence together, a moment that would forever be seared into their memories, and stumbled upon Shona's on the living room floor. In shock and disbelief, George rushed his daughter back outside to protect her from the awful scene. With shaking hands, he called 911 and relayed all the details of what he had found to the emergency dispatcher, unsure of what might come next. At that point, George and Shona had been living separately for several months due to their ongoing divorce process, and he insisted he had no knowledge of anyone who might wish to harm her. When the first paramedics arrived at the scene, it was already much too late to save Shona. According to interviews with neighbors, the attack most likely occurred sometime between 3:30 and 4 in the morning. During that window, a nearby resident said he heard a brief commotion, a few suspicious noises, but did not pay much attention, thinking it might be a domestic dispute or some kind of minor incident. Naturally, the first person who fell under suspicion was Shona's former husband, George Toffee, a man from whom Shona was currently in the process of divorcing. However, investigators soon ruled him out as a suspect when they found that George was at the fire station, surrounded by colleagues, for his 24-hour shift. A strong alibi that cleared him from any suspicion of wrongdoing. This left the case a puzzling mystery for both the police and the community. Some, especially Shona's sister Paula, remained unconvinced. In Paula's opinion, George was the only person who could possibly harm Shona, and she remained firm in her conviction. disregarding the facts that supported his alibi. Meanwhile, detectives kept all their options open and investigated other suspects. The case, which initially seemed perplexing and sad, soon began to gain momentum. Just 48 hours after Shona's death, the police received a phone call from a chance eyewitness, someone whose testimony would enable them to solve this puzzling case in record time. The caller was a man named William Penks, but many knew him simply as Big Will. William had been a fixture in Las Vegas for many years and was well known as a maintenance expert who kept numerous apartment buildings in proper condition. Shortly before this phone call, William had received an urgent call from a friend, someone eager to boast about something. A confession or a piece of information that could break the case wide open. This new lead was a turning point for the investigators, sending them down a path toward justice for Shona Toffee and hopefully offering some peace to her family in the wake of their immense tragedy. He was happy. Happy in a way that made him look as if he had just completed some significant mission for which he would soon be rewarded with a large sum of cash. His expression was one of pure satisfaction, a feeling of accomplishment, even a rush of adrenaline. During his story, his friend, meanwhile, was laughing with unmistakable pleasure, as if he had performed a heroic deed, and this filled William, Big Will, with deep resentment and disbelief. This was not something he could celebrate or appreciate in any way. Big Will tried his best to live a righteous, upstanding life under the Lord's guidance, as he often put it. His moral compass was strong. He made it a point to aid those in need, especially people who had stumbled or gone down a difficult path, individuals who had gotten out of prison and were looking for a chance at redemption. This was precisely why the story his friend was openly bragging about struck him as reprehensible and completely unacceptable. This crossed a moral boundary that Big Will could not ignore. It went far beyond the kind of people he was normally willing to help. The following morning, after wrestling with his conscience all night, Will decided it was his civic and moral duty to come forward and report what he knew to the police. At first, his message seemed somewhat implausible to the detectives, almost a wild tale that fell outside the ordinary course of crimes. Nevertheless, the police decided to follow up and see whether there might be a kernel of truth in his words. The man Big Will was worried about was a person named Neil Stevens. Stevens lived in a small, somewhat clandestine spot at the foot of the hills, far away from the glittering city center with its hotels, restaurants, and bustling tourists. Stevens was a former inmate, someone Big Will had been trying to help him find a new path in life, a path toward honesty, stability, and peace. Because William didn't know his friend's exact address, he instead led the police to a nearby grocery store, where Stevens was frequently seen. And by pure coincidence, the detectives stumbled upon their suspect there, on the corner of a side street, quietly minding his own business. The officers proceeded to arrest Stevens due to prohibited substances found in his possession, and transported him to the police station for questioning. The homeless man insisted he hadn't done anything related to Shona Toffee's death. He repeatedly said the police had made a mess by arresting him. He was the wrong person. Detectives, meanwhile, began to doubt their own assumptions. They couldn't see a clear connection between a vagrant with a small record, a man previously convicted of theft, unlawful possession, or disturbing the peace, and a respectable woman whose death seemed so puzzling. Until this moment, none of his crimes had involved violence or aggression toward another person. Furthermore, there seemed to be no realistic motive for him to harm Shona Toffee. To be exhaustive in their search for the truth, the detectives decided to track down Stevens's temporary dwelling, the small, worn-out tent that he called home, and see if there was anything there that might provide additional clues or physical evidence. During their search, a team of forensic experts stumbled upon several crucial finds. Among them was a pair of pants that, after subsequent testing, turned out to carry traces of Shona's DNA, a piece of physical evidence tying him directly to the victim. Inside the small, tattered refuge, the investigators also found a price tag with a barcode from a hammer that had been purchased at a nearby supermarket just a short time before the incident. Back at police headquarters, the detectives presented this new information to Neil Stevens. They decided to use a tactic frequently used in difficult cases. They suggested to him that someone might be framing him, and that it was in his best interest to come clean and tell them everything he knew. This tactic produced a dramatic result. Instead of denying his guilt, Stevens fell silent for a moment, then nodded and began to confess. He openly admitted that he was indeed the person who attacked Shona Toffee. His confession fell from him piece by piece, a story filled with details. Yet there was a key piece missing. Detectives couldn't initially understand his motives. Why would he attack Shona in particular? What had driven him to commit this awful act? The answer to their growing number of questions came to light when the police examined Stevens's phone. Among its many contacts, there was a name that stood out: George. Detectives asked him directly who George was, and Stevens reluctantly explained that George was his friend, the firefighter, a man he knew well. This George turned out to be none other than George Teefee, Shona's own husband. Neil Stevens was the homeless man whom George had hired from time to time to do small, odd jobs around their home and garden, a person who had inadvertently become a point of conflict and controversy in their marriage. George's phone number appeared repeatedly in the call log, a total of 87 exchanges in the last month before Shona's death, adding a dramatic twist to the case. The two men had a hidden understanding. One needed money, while the other wanted to undermine his wife's happiness, creating a conspiracy forged by resentment, financial struggles, and a growing domestic crisis. This unusual alliance fell into place, piece by piece, until the true story was made clear to the investigators. A story of betrayal, weakness, and tragedy. He very skillfully manipulated the vulnerable vagrant, who literally hung on his every word. Stevens saw him as a kind of older brother, a friend, a person he could trust completely. In many ways, George Teefee filled a void in his life, someone he admired and was eager to please at any cost. Stevens openly said he idolized George, believing him to be his closest friend, someone who truly cared for him when nobody else did. This loyalty made him ready to do anything George asked of him, even something unimaginable. Then, the team of detectives turned their attention toward a crucial piece of physical evidence, the price tag from the hammer. And their subsequent inquiry revealed that it had been purchased at a nearby major retail store. This new lead opened up a path for investigators to piece together the timeline of events. They painstakingly reviewed hundreds upon hundreds of hours of surveillance camera footage, a task that seemed exhaustive and overwhelming, but their persistence eventually paid off. Finally, a breakthrough came when the investigators noticed George Teefee and Neil Stevens together in the recordings, casually shopping side by side, placing a hammer, a ski mask, and black-colored clothing into their cart. The video clearly captured their faces, smiling, talking, and looking completely at ease, a moment that would become a key piece of testimony in court. Meanwhile, Stevens continued to share his side of the story with the investigators in greater depth. According to him, George had offered him $600 to carry out the killing of his own wife, Shona, with the understanding that several $1,000s more would be handed over once George received a payout from her life insurance policy. The small burglary that had taken place just a few weeks prior was meant as a kind of trial run, a way for Stevens to familiarize himself with the layout of Shona's home and its entry points in case something went awry. George even allowed him to steal his wife's wedding ring and pawn it, adding a small financial incentive, a perverted form of a tip for a man wrestling with difficult financial struggles. Eventually, under mounting pressure, the suspect voluntarily agreed to show the police where he had buried the actual murder weapon, a heavy tool that had been used to carry out the attack. This marked a turning point in the case, adding a crucial piece of physical proof alongside the suspect's testimony. In the end, everything that the arrest of Neil Stevens revealed was more than enough to enable the arrest of George Teefee as an accomplice in this tragedy. However, instead of proceeding directly with arresting the firefighter on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder, investigators made a somewhat unusual decision. For some reason, they first called his mother and sister and quietly informed them that George was suspected of being involved in a serious crime against Shona. This phone call, made on the 9th day after Shona's death, turned the suspect's family's world upside down. As soon as the relatives learned the bitter and painful truth, they rushed to dial George's phone number in a state of disbelief and alarm. A few minutes after this phone conversation, the team of police officers, who were already keeping George Teefee under surveillance and closely monitoring his phone, overheard his sister calling him to tell him he was now suspected of taking his wife's life. Shortly after that, George darted out of his residence, jumped into his truck, and sped away down the highway in a dramatic and desperate attempt to escape whatever fate might await him. George Teefee weaved recklessly through city streets and then turned onto Summerlin Parkway. His vehicle accelerated to a breakneck 85 miles per hour before he suddenly and violently crashed into a barrier alongside the highway. Police later described this incident as a suspected end-it-all attempt. Noting that there were no skid marks, a clear sign that George hadn't tried to slow down or avoid the collision. His intent appeared to be quite deliberate. However, much to everyone's astonishment, George Toffee survived the collision. According to emergency responders, he was wearing a seatbelt, which kept him alive upon impact. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, where doctors treated his injuries, and where detectives subsequently placed him under arrest. When George was formally presented with the charges that he was suspected of organizing the killing of Shona Tiffy, he simply raised his gaze from his hospital bed, nodded quietly, and said, "Okay." Meanwhile, back at the police station, Neil Stevens was also formally charged in the killing. All of these revelations came as a shock to Shona's family, adding to their immense tragedy. Yet there was a small measure of relief. If George Toffee's suicide attempt had been successful, he might have avoided justice, adding further agony for the victims' relatives. But instead, he remained alive and would face trial alongside his accomplice. More than 3 months after their arrest, Neil Stevens chose to plead guilty to taking Shona Tiffy's life. In exchange for this confession, and for agreeing not to pursue the death penalty, the prosecutor insisted that he must provide testimony against George. The main challenge was that Stevens was still fiercely loyal to George and seemed unsure whether he could bring himself to speak against him. Nevertheless, this person was quite vulnerable and easily influenced, which meant the lawyers were able to persuade him to become a key state's witness. Later, in August 2015, at the court hearing, Neil Stevens did everything he could to explain to the jury in vivid detail exactly what had happened, how he fell under George's influence, and how together they fell into a conspiracy that resulted in tragedy. The defense team fiercely challenged Stevens' entire account during cross-examination, putting forward every possible inconsistency and casting doubt upon his credibility as a key witness in the case. Big Will, who also appeared in court to provide testimony for the prosecution, was not spared from this aggressive questioning. During cross-examination, he reluctantly admitted that Stevens was not a person whose words should be trusted without careful scrutiny. This moment seemed to undermine the state's case, fueling suspicion that their principal testimony might be less reliable than first believed. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavy with doubt, the kind of doubt that could make a jury reconsider its view on a person's guilt. The main objective for the prosecutors was not just to rely on the testimony of a questionable accomplice. Their aim was to show the jury that George Tiffy was fully capable of organizing and executing a brutal crime. Prosecutors presented a significant amount of incriminating evidence to help connect George Tiffy directly to the conspiracy. Among the most dramatic elements were surveillance camera recordings that captured George and Stevens together as they purchased a hammer, a ski mask, and other items that, according to investigators, were meant to aid in the commission of the killing. George's defense team tried their best to downplay these recordings, arguing that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for their purchases, insisting that the two men were simply buying tools and materials for ordinary household repairs, and that there was absolutely no sinister intent behind their actions. George remained impassive and calm, sitting quietly at the defense table without displaying a single sign of nervousness or remorse. His expression stayed perfectly composed, adding an aura of disbelief to the dramatic trial unfolding in the courtroom. After a trial that spanned an entire week, during which nearly 40 witnesses were called to the stand, alongside a staggering 400 pieces of physical evidence, the 12 jurors were left to determine George Tiffy's fate. The jury, made up of individuals from various walks of life, deliberated for a total of 3 long days. Inside the courtroom, the two families sat quietly, awaiting the moment when the jury would pronounce its decision. Shona's relatives, many dressed in shades of pink, her favorite color, held hands and supported each other through the immense stress of the trial. Meanwhile, George's supporters remained firm in their disbelief, insisting that he was not involved in his wife's death and trusting that justice would be done. Finally, after extensive deliberations, the jury rendered its verdict. The moment fell heavy upon everyone present, the moment when the true character of George Tiffy was forced into the light. The jury found him guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and first-degree murder, delivering a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was read aloud, George stood up quietly, with the very same impassive expression he had maintained from the start of the trial. Not a tremor, not a break in his mask, while Shona's family openly cried tears of justice, relief, and deep sadness for their immense and permanent loss. Nevertheless, not everyone was completely satisfied with the outcome. Some felt there were still unanswered questions, while others insisted the punishment fell short in delivering true justice. Neil Stevens, the man who physically carried out George's plans, was also convicted and received a sentence of life imprisonment with a minimum term of 42 years to be served before he could be considered for parole. His fate was a dramatic affirmation that justice had indeed been done, although many people involved in the case remained haunted by its details, wondering whether there might still be more to uncover in the tragedy that had shattered their community. An emergency 911 call was placed, prompting a quick response from local authorities. When first responders arrived at the address, they found Alex waiting outside the main entrance to the apartment complex. His behavior was immediately alarming. He was visibly shaken, pacing back and forth, his eyes darting nervously toward the building, as if wary of what was inside. When responders entered the apartment, they were met with a scene that was both chaotic and unsettling. It looked as if it had been taken apart. But the scariest part was in the bedroom. On the bed lay Christina. Christina Carlin Craft entered the world on July 11, 1998, born into a loving, tight-knit family that valued resilience, togetherness, and personal strength. Her early childhood was marked by joy and the warm presence of a devoted mother and father. Christina's home was a space filled with laughter, sibling companionship, and the protective embrace of a caring household. However, life dealt the family a devastating blow in 1990 when Christina was just 9 years old. Her beloved mother tragically passed away after a sudden illness, leaving behind a void that no one could fully fill. After finishing high school, Christina took her first step into adulthood by accepting a job as a waitress at a coastal casino. While this was not her ultimate dream, it was a critical stepping stone that allowed her to gain life experience, independence, and self-discipline. The buzzing world of casinos, filled with characters from all walks of life, taught her important lessons in people skills and perseverance. Beneath the surface, however, Christina was fueled by a greater ambition. With her striking looks, magnetic presence, and confident poise, she longed for a life in the spotlight. Her dream wasn't just to be seen, it was to be recognized, celebrated, and respected in the world of high fashion and modeling. It was during the summer of 2003, in the vibrant and unpredictable atmosphere of the casino, that Christina's life took a new turn. One evening, she caught the attention of a sharply dressed and poised investor. Their conversation was brief, but impactful. And it wasn't long before Christina found herself mingling with well-connected individuals in the business world. Among them was Alex Chiotelli, a prominent banker with a composed demeanor and thoughtful charm. Unlike many who admired Christina from afar, Alex saw her for who she truly was: intelligent, driven, and determined. Their connection deepened quickly, and what began as an intriguing encounter blossomed into a deep and meaningful relationship. Christina and Alex's bond grew stronger with each passing year. For 14 years, they shared their lives, supporting each other through various highs and lows. They lived together in Ardmore as true partners, though Christina wasn't in a rush to start a family. Her goals remained centered around self-fulfillment and professional achievement. Alex, understanding and supportive, never pressured her. Instead, he encouraged her aspirations. Christina, driven by childhood dreams, pursued modeling with renewed vigor. She had dabbled in the field when she was younger, landing a few small gigs, but now, with Alex's unwavering support and her own matured self-confidence, opportunities began arriving more consistently. Christina had her sights set on something specific: the iconic world of Playboy, a magazine known for launching the careers of countless models. For her, being featured in Playboy wasn't merely about glamour. It represented the apex of success, the moment when all her years of perseverance would pay off. She submitted her portfolio, joining the ranks of thousands of hopeful women across the country who dreamed of being noticed. Against all odds, she received a call that would forever remain etched in her memory. In early 2009, Christina was informed that she had been selected as Playboy's Girl of the Week, a prestigious spotlight that introduced models to the magazine's vast readership. The shoot was scheduled for May 4, 2009, and everything about it, lighting, styling, and atmosphere, felt magical. Though it was not the full feature or cover story she longed for, it was a significant achievement and a stepping stone in the right direction. Christina gave the shoot her all, and the results were stunning. She radiated charisma and elegance, capturing the attention of industry insiders. That single feature opened up doors to an entirely new world. Christina was suddenly invited to high-profile events, mingling with actors, musicians, and public figures. She even received recognition from Hugh Hefner himself, who acknowledged her potential and welcomed her into the Playboy circle. It seemed like her dream life was finally within reach. The excitement and momentum, a new challenge emerged, one that Christina couldn't control. At the time of her photo shoot, she was already 26 years old. In the fast-paced and often youth-obsessed world of modeling, age was a major factor. Industry insiders subtly signaled that her window of opportunity might be closing. Though she continued to strive for that elusive cover feature, it never materialized. Still, Christina was not one to dwell in disappointment. She refused to let one door closing define her. With her characteristic determination, she pivoted toward new creative pursuits, exploring acting, business ventures, and other artistic outlets. She attended auditions at some of the most competitive agencies in the United States. Though feedback on her talent and appearance were consistently positive, landing the right role remained elusive. At times, it seemed her association with Playboy, while glamorous, carried certain stigmas in more conservative industries. As her public profile grew, Christina also encountered a darker side of fame. After her appearance in Playboy, she began receiving unwanted attention. While many fans were kind and respectful, others became intrusive and obsessive. It was a distressing realization that being in the spotlight could attract individuals with ill intentions. Christina, ever resilient, tried to maintain her normal life, but the psychological toll was real. Then came August 21st, 2018, a date that would mark a turning point. Alex had to travel to New York on business. It wasn't an unusual trip. He frequently traveled for work and trusted that Christina, familiar with managing things on her own, would be perfectly fine during his short absence. That evening, as per their routine, Alex tried to call her to say goodnight. When she didn't pick up, he wasn't immediately alarmed. Christina often had a busy schedule and could easily have been at a social gathering or simply asleep. But by the next morning, concern began to set in. Repeated calls went unanswered. Christina's phone remained silent, something highly uncharacteristic for someone who was almost always accessible. Alex's unease grew steadily throughout the day. Though he attempted to focus on meetings and professional commitments, a nagging sense of dread began to cloud his mind. By evening, worry had transformed into panic. This wasn't like her. He decided to cut his trip short and rush back to their shared apartment in Ardmore. When Alex finally arrived at the building that warm August evening, the clock was approaching 9 p.m. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet, tree-lined street of Ardmore's affluent residential neighborhood. It was a place known for its manicured lawns, serene sidewalks, and a sense of unshakable calm. But that night, something felt deeply, disturbingly off. With rising concern, Alex reached the front door of the apartment he shared with Christina. He fumbled through his keyring, trying to insert the familiar brass key into the lock, but it wouldn't turn. Perplexed, he tried again, and again. Still nothing. The key, which had always opened the door without trouble, now didn't fit. For a brief moment, Alex hoped that perhaps Christina had simply locked the door from the inside using the deadbolt. Maybe she had fallen asleep, he told himself. Maybe she was in the shower. Or perhaps she had simply misplaced her phone and didn't hear the calls. But deep down, Alex knew this wasn't right. The silence on the other end of his repeated phone calls all day had planted a seed of dread that now bloomed into full-fledged alarm. He knocked firmly, then pounded harder, calling out Christina's name several times. No response. Not a single sound came from inside. The building's walls seemed to close in with an eerie stillness. Left with no other choice, Alex called the police. The dispatcher on the line took down the address and details with professional calm. But when officers were first dispatched, there was a noticeable delay in their urgency. The neighborhood was considered low risk, and officers were used to responding to noise complaints, lost pets, or false alarms. However, one of the patrol officers who reviewed the address had a sharp memory. He suddenly recalled that just 4 days earlier, he had personally responded to a report of a robbery at that exact location. Christina had filed that report herself, describing strange events and missing items. This new call now seemed far more serious. The possibility that the previous incident could be connected to something more dangerous gripped the officer. The pieces started forming a troubling pattern, one that could no longer be ignored. Could the intruder have returned? Could the situation have escalated into something truly catastrophic? Officers were promptly rerouted to the address. When they arrived, they found Alex waiting near the entrance of the building, visibly shaken, his pacing betrayed by increasing worry. As he recounted his attempts to reach Christina and the strange malfunctioning of the key, the officers decided to act immediately. They announced their presence loudly, then forcibly broke down the door when there was still no response. What awaited them inside would etch itself into their memories forever. The apartment, once tastefully decorated and pristine, was in disarray. Furniture had been upended, drawers pulled out and emptied onto the floor. A large decorative mirror in the hallway was shattered, its jagged pieces reflecting fractured glimpses of the scene. The sense of chaos was palpable. And then came the discovery no one wanted to make. In the bedroom, on the bed, they found Christina. The scene was disturbing, but not something we need to sensationalize. What mattered now was justice, and it had to be swift and thorough. As protocol dictated, the partner, Alex, was treated as a person of interest. That night, while investigators processed the apartment, officers gently informed Alex of what had been discovered. His reaction was instant and heartbreaking. He collapsed into a chair in disbelief, unable to form coherent sentences. His shock was unmistakable, his grief unfiltered. He was taken to the station for questioning, a routine step in such cases. Over the next 90 minutes, detectives carefully reviewed his alibi. Alex's whereabouts during the day were corroborated by travel logs, hotel check-in data, and phone records. Surveillance footage from the hotel lobby and business meetings verified everything. There was no room for doubt. Alex had nothing to do with what had happened. He was, undeniably, a grieving partner, and not a suspect. With that avenue closed, investigators had to start from the beginning. How could such a crime occur in one of the city's safest neighborhoods? Who could have done this? And why? Detectives immediately turned to Christina's recent police report. The timing was far too close to be a coincidence. 4 days earlier, on August 18th, Christina had come to the station and reported an alarming experience. She explained that she had gone out the night before, Friday, August 17th, to a popular downtown bar. It was a weekend tradition for her, a way to unwind and enjoy a night out with friends or new acquaintances. She was known to be cautious, never reckless, but something had gone terribly wrong that night. Christina told officers she had arrived home around 3 a.m. the next morning. When she woke up hours later, it was not in her bed, but sprawled on the cold floor of her apartment. Her head was pounding with a violent headache, and she felt a strange, disoriented fog clouding her memory. She couldn't recall how she got home or anything past a certain point in the night. Alarmed, she searched her apartment, only to discover that several items were missing. Her report detailed what she believed had been stolen: high-end designer handbags, several pieces of fine jewelry, a collection of expensive shoes, and a number of credit cards. Christina was convinced she had been drugged at the bar, perhaps with something slipped into her drink and then robbed while unconscious. She had no memory of giving anyone access to her apartment. A crucial clue surfaced in the report. Christina remembered taking a taxi home. The driver, she noted, was a man in his early 30s, clean-shaven, polite, and driving a dark-colored vehicle. Thanks to the timestamps from her phone and traffic cameras along the route, detectives were able to trace the car and retrieve footage of the drop-off. The quality of the video was grainy but usable. With the driver partially visible in the frame, investigators released the footage to the public, appealing for any information that could help identify the man. Simultaneously, detectives began digging deeper into Christina's digital presence. She was highly active on social media, where she had thousands of followers and often posted about her professional and personal life. Through this digital footprint, authorities discovered a past incident from 2016 that had raised some eyebrows at the time. News archives documented a minor but noteworthy confrontation at an upscale Manhattan restaurant. According to the report, Christina had argued with the restaurant manager. She was arrested that night, a humiliating experience for someone already wary of media attention. However, thanks to Alex's influence, legal support, and diligent efforts, the issue was resolved quietly. Christina was released on 6 months probation, with no lasting damage to her record. The incident had since been buried in the past, or so it seemed. During the murder investigation, Detectives briefly explored the possibility that the former restaurant employee might have harbored resentment. However, this theory didn't hold up under scrutiny. The suspect had left the hospitality industry years ago, had no known contact with Christina since the altercation, and appeared to have no motive to seek revenge. With no further evidence linking him to the case, that lead was quickly discarded. Attention soon turned to Christina's more recent life in Ardmore. While she had moved there in search of peace and a quieter environment, it hadn't been an easy adjustment. Christina had always thrived in vibrant, bustling social scenes. The calm streets of suburban Ardmore felt confining to someone used to the bright lights of city nightlife and the buzzing atmosphere of red carpet events. Though she tried to adapt, friends recalled that she often felt isolated and restless. As investigators delved deeper into her background, they came across Christina's modeling history, specifically her appearance in Playboy. To detectives, this was a crucial discovery. It wasn't uncommon for models in the public eye to attract unwanted attention. Cases involving stalking, impersonation, and data breaches were tragically frequent. Christina had created several professional accounts across multiple modeling platforms to market her portfolio. Investigators theorized that one of those public accounts might have exposed personal information or attracted someone with malicious intentions. Around the same time, detectives began reviewing Christina's financial activity. They traced her credit card usage and discovered something deeply troubling. Less than 24 hours after her death, one of her cards had been used at a grocery store located just a few blocks from her apartment. Surveillance footage revealed the individual who made the purchase. It was the same taxi driver Christina had taken a ride with on the night of her reported robbery, a man named Andre Melton. Armed with this information, detectives wasted no time. They secured a search warrant for Andre's residence and an arrest warrant on charges of burglary and unauthorized card use. But when police arrived at his address, Andre was gone. He had fled the scene, possibly after sensing that the law was closing in. Despite his absence, the search of his home was revealing. Inside, officers recovered numerous personal belongings that had been reported missing from Christina's apartment. Luxury handbags, designer shoes, high-end jewelry, and more. However, recovering stolen property was no longer their priority. The urgency now centered on apprehending a suspect potentially connected to a far more serious crime. Meanwhile, the medical examiner's report had been finalized and delivered. The findings confirmed what detectives had feared from the outset. Christina's death was officially ruled a homicide. The cause of death and details of the assault were left undisclosed in media briefings out of respect for the family and to maintain the integrity of the ongoing investigation. Still, this report confirmed the most serious suspicion. Christina hadn't died by accident or misadventure. She had been intentionally harmed. As investigators combed through hours of surveillance footage from Christina's apartment building and surrounding areas, they made another startling discovery. A second man was captured entering the building shortly before the suspected time of the crime. He was approximately the same age and build as Andre Melton, but clearly a different person. More importantly, while both men were recorded entering the building, neither was seen exiting. This mystery man instantly became the investigation's new focal point. His image was enhanced and released to the public along with a plea for any information. As with many high-profile cases, the circulation of these photos across news networks and social media had an almost immediate impact. On August 22nd, just one day after the public release of the footage, a surprising call came into the police station. It was from Andre Melton himself. Clearly shaken by seeing his face aired on television alongside an unnamed second suspect, Andre reached out to clarify his involvement. During the tense phone call, he admitted to the break-in on August 18th. He confessed to stealing items from Christina's apartment but insisted he had no part in her murder. According to him, the night he robbed her, Christina had still been alive. He refused to turn himself in, however, fearful that he would be wrongly charged with the killing. The manhunt for Andre continued, now complicated by this partial confession. Then came a strange twist in the case, one that originated from an unexpected place. On October 26th, over 2 months after Christina's death, a new tip surfaced. A man contacted authorities and claimed he had recognized the face of the unknown second suspect from the surveillance footage shown in the news. This wasn't a casual acquaintance. The caller said that he had recently been institutionalized in a psychiatric facility, and during his stay, he had shared a ward with the man in question. According to the witness, the man, whose name he did not know, had been admitted following a violent incident involving an attack on a woman. His behavior was volatile, and the staff had kept a close watch on him for 3 days before his discharge. But during their time together, the two had spoken. The witness recalled a disturbing conversation in which the patient described having plans to visit a woman he had met online. The details, though vague at the time, now seemed chillingly specific in hindsight. Detectives rushed to the clinic to gather more information. They needed a name, a diagnosis, anything that could help identify this individual. What they found was deeply frustrating. The facility had failed to verify the man's full identity before discharging him, and the paper trail was non-existent. The hospital had released him with no documented follow-up. The lead had seemingly hit a dead end, but fate intervened. On August 29th, just as it seemed the case might go cold again, another breakthrough occurred. A man came forward claiming to recognize the unknown suspect. He identified the man as Jonathan Wesley Harris, a 31-year-old recently released from prison. Harris had served time for a violent offense classified as a particularly serious felony. Alarmingly, he had only been out of prison for about a month when Christina was killed. With this new information, detectives sprang into action. They contacted everyone who might have known Harris: friends, neighbors, former parole officers, and family. Eventually, they reached his sister. After some hesitation, she revealed that Jonathan had left Philadelphia recently. According to her, he had boarded a bus headed for Pittsburgh. Law enforcement moved swiftly. They alerted local agencies along the suspected travel route and worked with the transit company to intercept the vehicle. When the bus finally arrived in Pittsburgh, officers surrounded it. They observed the passengers disembarking carefully. Jonathan Wesley Harris was the third person to step off the bus. He was taken into custody without resistance. The officers didn't press him immediately. They laid out a photograph, one that showed Christina in a candid, smiling moment, radiant and full of life. Jonathan glanced at the photo. After a few seconds, he nodded and spoke in a low voice. He claimed that he had met Christina in a bar several nights before her death. According to him, they had struck up what seemed like a casual conversation. They chatted for a while, and at some point during the evening, she agreed to leave the bar with him. He said they took a taxi together back to her apartment. From there, his story took a darker and more confusing turn. Jonathan alleged that after they arrived at Christina's home, he requested a payment, specifically $1,200, for what he vaguely described as services and substances. Jonathan claimed that at one point, in the middle of the argument, he briefly restrained Christina. He insisted that afterward he had a change of heart. According to him, he told her he wanted to calm things down, untie her, and simply leave. He said that Christina appeared to agree. But when he loosened the restraints, she didn't wait. Instead, she immediately ran for the door, likely trying to escape. Jonathan said he chased after her. And then, in his words, something terrible happened. He offered no specifics, only vague phrases that avoided directly addressing the level of violence or the final outcome. Investigators took note of this evasion. After the incident, Jonathan claimed he panicked. He searched the apartment, allegedly hoping to find valuables that would help him recoup what he said he had lost during the night. But nothing of significant value turned up. He reportedly took some clothing, which he later used to change out of his own, in a clear attempt to avoid being recognized on any nearby security footage. The police would later determine that Jonathan had exited the apartment not through the front door, but by climbing out onto the balcony, an effort that appeared both desperate and calculated. He had left the apartment without being seen by the building's security cameras, reinforcing the theory that he had planned his escape with at least some level of awareness. In follow-up interviews and under repeated questioning, Jonathan maintained his stance that he had not intended to harm Christina. As the case moved toward trial, Jonathan's legal team attempted to mount a defense focused on diminished responsibility. They argued that the incident was not first-degree murder, but rather a crime committed under the influence of substances and mental instability. They proposed that at most, he was guilty of involuntary manslaughter, a crime committed in the heat of the moment, without clear intent. They even revisited Jonathan's time in the psychiatric hospital, emphasizing his unstable behavior and erratic conversations as indicators that he was not in full control of his faculties. But the prosecution presented a clear, forceful rebuttal. They pointed to several key facts: Jonathan's decision to flee the city after the incident, his initial refusal to turn himself in, and the series of lies he told during his confession. Most critically, the prosecution reminded the jury that Jonathan never had to be there in the first place. There was no legal or personal obligation that bound him to Christina. The moment he felt angry or rejected, he could have walked away. Instead, he stayed. He cornered. He controlled. And ultimately, a woman lost her life. The prosecutors also referenced statements made by a witness who had briefly shared a ward with Jonathan at the psychiatric facility. That witness remembered Jonathan speaking in disturbingly casual terms about following women. Though these statements could not be linked to other crimes definitively, they contributed to a growing sense of unease around Jonathan's motives. The jury took everything into account: the evidence, the testimony, the contradictory statements, and the failed attempts at deflection. After deliberating, the verdict was delivered. Jonathan Wesley Harris was found guilty on all counts: first-degree intentional murder, kidnapping, theft, escape, and obstruction of justice. The sentence reflected the gravity of the crime. He received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 22.5 years for the related charges. On the morning of December 25, 2010, Christmas Day, a couple, out for a quiet holiday walk with their 2 dogs, had ventured into a lightly wooded area near their home. One of the dogs, suddenly, pawing frantically at something partially buried beneath the fresh layer of snow. What they found stopped them cold. Police arrived swiftly at the scene. After securing the area and beginning a preliminary investigation, law enforcement officers quickly identified several personal effects and physical features that helped them confirm the victim's identity. They were those Joanna Yates. Joanna Claire Yates was born on April 19, 1985, in the peaceful country of Hampshire in southern England. Her upbringing was filled with love and warmth, with a strong emphasis on education and personal growth. From childhood, Joanna was known for her gentle nature and curious mind. She excelled in school, particularly in subjects related to design and creative thinking. With a clear sense of purpose, Joanna pursued her education and eventually earned a degree in landscape architecture. This field, which combined her passion for design, nature, and innovation, was the perfect fit for her vision. Just 2 years older than Joanna, Greg was intelligent, ambitious, and shared many of her values and goals. In 2008, a new chapter in Joanna's life began when she met Greg Reardon, a young, talented engineer working in the same industry. In the autumn of 2010, Joanna received an exciting job offer from a prestigious architectural and construction firm in Bristol. Greg, ever supportive, arranged a transfer within his own company to a branch in Bristol, ensuring that they could stay together as they adjusted to the new city. On Friday, December 17, 2010, their routine was unexpectedly disrupted. Greg had planned a weekend trip to Sheffield to visit his parents before the holiday rush, while Joanna stayed behind in Bristol. She had planned to finish her holiday preparations, including wrapping presents and preparing for Greg's return. She also mentioned that she was meeting friends and colleagues for drinks after work to celebrate the upcoming holidays and unwind after a busy week. Joanna went out with her friends that evening, joining them at a nearby bar. The atmosphere was festive and relaxed, and she seemed in good spirits. At some point, she called Greg, who was already in Sheffield. They exchanged loving words, and she reassured him that she was enjoying her evening. That was the last time Greg heard from her. After Joanna left the bar around 8:30 p.m., she walked back to their apartment. It was a short walk, and she was likely looking forward to a quiet evening at home. However, something went terribly wrong during the short walk. When Greg returned to Bristol on Sunday, December 19th, he grew concerned when Joanna didn't respond to his calls or messages. Initially, he thought she had just had a late night out, but by Monday morning, when she still hadn't replied, his worry deepened. He reported her missing to the police immediately. The investigation into Joanna's disappearance began quickly. She was known for her reliability and independence, and her sudden disappearance seemed out of character. The police interviewed her friends, family, and colleagues, but no one had seen or heard from her after she left the bar. There were no signs of forced entry or disturbance at their apartment, suggesting that Joanna had left voluntarily. But the circumstances of her disappearance were deeply unsettling. On Christmas Day, December 25, 2010, the peaceful holiday morning was shattered when a couple out for a walk in a snowy wooded area discovered a body buried under the snow. Their dog had been pawing at the snow, and as they investigated, they found what turned out to be Joanna's remains. Police were immediately called to the scene, and soon, they confirmed the tragic news that the body was indeed Joanna Yates. This discovery marked the beginning of a high-profile murder investigation, and the community was shaken by the brutal loss of a young woman who had so much potential. What had initially seemed like a quiet, promising life for Joanna and Greg was now overshadowed by the dark mysteries surrounding her death. The investigation would uncover more about the last days of Joanna's life, ultimately leading to a series of shocking revelations. Laughter echoed over the clinking of glasses, and conversations drifted between work topics and holiday excitement. Joanna appeared happy and engaged, enjoying the time spent with people she trusted. At approximately 8 p.m., she said her goodbyes, mentioning that she wanted to pick up something for dinner before heading home for the night. Surveillance footage from a local supermarket later confirmed that she stopped in to purchase a ready-made pizza and a couple of beverages. Simple comforts for a quiet evening in. After completing her purchase, she exited the store alone and began making her way home. She called Greg around this time, telling him she had just left the store and would message him again before bed. That would be the last time anyone heard directly from her. Over the weekend, Greg tried several times to reach Joanna by phone and text. Though he grew increasingly uneasy, he initially assumed that signal issues or a low phone battery might be the cause of her silence. The area they lived in occasionally experienced reception problems, and Joanna had mentioned feeling tired. Perhaps she had simply turned in early, or was preoccupied with errands. But by Sunday afternoon, Greg's concern turned into deep worry. He drove back to Bristol, arriving in the early evening. Upon entering their apartment, a wave of unease washed over him. The front door, which Joanna was always meticulous about locking, was ajar. Inside, the home was eerily quiet. Her handbag, keys, and wallet were in their usual places near the entrance. Her phone lay face down on the living room couch, its battery depleted but untouched since the last use. Their cat, normally lively and well cared for, appeared agitated and noticeably hungry, signs that it hadn't been fed in a couple of days. Joanna's shoes and winter coat remained by the door, suggesting she hadn't left the house after returning that night. Her car, too, was still parked in the driveway, unmoved. Nothing had been visibly disturbed, yet everything felt strangely off, as if time had paused the moment she walked through the door. Fearing something was genuinely wrong, Greg contacted several of Joanna's close friends and her parents. Each call confirmed his worst fears. No one had heard from her since Friday evening. With rising anxiety, he contacted the police and filed a missing person report. The investigation began swiftly. Authorities conducted a full search of the property, spoke with neighbors, and worked to establish a detailed timeline of Joanna's final known movements. They confirmed that she had been at work that Friday and had gone out with colleagues to a local bar afterward. Surveillance footage from the bar and the supermarket corroborated her movements up to a certain point. She had indeed purchased a meal and drinks shortly before heading home. Joanna Yates is believed to have returned home sometime around 9 p.m. that Friday evening, following a cheerful gathering with friends and colleagues. Text message records later confirmed that shortly after arriving, she engaged in casual conversations with a few close friends, chatting about the upcoming Christmas party they had all been planning together. The tone of the messages was upbeat and lighthearted. There was no indication that anything was wrong or that Joanna felt uneasy. Inside the apartment, signs of her routine were immediately visible. The kitchen revealed a quiet, domestic scene. The oven had been used, a pizza box was missing, a plate had been placed neatly on the counter, and 2 chilled bottles of beer sat waiting on the table. One of the bottles had been opened, though barely touched. Only a small amount had been consumed. It appeared that Joanna had been preparing for a simple, peaceful evening at home, likely intending to enjoy her dinner, relax, and perhaps watch a bit of television or continue wrapping holiday gifts. But something happened. Something unexplainable, abrupt, and completely outside the normal rhythm of her life. The apartment showed no signs of chaos or disarray. There were no broken locks, no shattered glass, and no damage to suggest forced entry. There were also no obvious signs of a confrontation or physical disturbance. Her valuables, cash, bank cards, electronic devices, remained untouched and in their usual places. Based on this, investigators quickly ruled out robbery as a potential motive. A particularly curious detail drew their attention. Although the plate and cutlery had been set out, there was no trace of the pizza. It had been purchased, according to the receipt, and the oven had clearly been used. Yet, The packaging was not found in the trash, and no remnants of the meal were discovered in the home. It was as if that part of the evening had been interrupted before it could fully unfold. The napkin, utensils, and clean plate seemed frozen in time, mute evidence of a meal that never happened. Near the front door, Joanna's purse and keys had been placed as usual. Among the items on the small table was the receipt from the supermarket where she had stopped after leaving the bar. The timestamp confirmed she had bought the pizza and drinks at approximately 8:30 p.m., aligning with what her friends and Greg already knew. Authorities launched a formal search operation on Monday, December 20th. With each hour that passed, urgency grew. Joanna was not the type of person to disappear without informing anyone. Her family, friends, and partner all described her as reliable, responsible, and deeply considerate. For her to be missing, without communication, without reason, was completely out of character. Detectives carefully retraced her last known movements. They examined footage from traffic and security cameras between the supermarket and her residence. The recordings confirmed she had driven herself home, alone. There were no indications that anyone followed her vehicle, nor did she appear to make any unplanned stops. Investigators meticulously reviewed the footage, but found nothing overtly suspicious. Parallel to the search efforts, investigators began the process of interviewing people in Joanna's life, starting with those closest to her. As is standard protocol in missing person cases, special attention was given to her romantic partner. Greg Reardon, understandably devastated and anxious, fully cooperated with police. Given his proximity to the situation, he was initially treated as a person of interest, not because of suspicion, but because statistical data often points to someone close to the victim in such cases. Detectives needed to ensure they could confirm his whereabouts beyond all doubt. Greg had told authorities he had left for Sheffield that Friday evening to visit his parents for the weekend. This claim was supported by multiple verifiable details. He had worked a full day before departing for the drive north. Along the way, he had stopped at a service station along the motorway. The transaction was confirmed by a time-stamped receipt from approximately 9 p.m. Further confirmation came from his family. By 9:30 p.m., he had arrived at his parents' home. His presence there throughout the weekend was consistently corroborated by his relatives. Investigators conducted a thorough check and found no indication that he had returned to Bristol during that time. With his alibi confirmed, Greg was officially cleared from the list of suspects. 5 days passed with no sign of Joanna. As Christmas approached, the atmosphere around the case became more tense and heartbreaking. Her family remained in Bristol, clinging to hope, while volunteers distributed flyers and posters. The story received growing attention from the media, with news channels covering the case and encouraging members of the public to come forward with any information, no matter how minor it might seem. Then, on the morning of December 2010, Christmas Day, a call was placed to local authorities that would shift the nature of the investigation entirely. A couple had been walking their 2 dogs along a quiet, snow-dusted trail near a wooded area in the Phelan district, approximately 3 miles from Joanna's apartment. One of their pets began to dig curiously at something beneath the fresh layer of snow. As they approached, the couple realized they had come across something deeply troubling and immediately notified police. Law enforcement responded promptly. When they arrived at the scene, they began a careful, methodical process to investigate what had been discovered. Based on identifying features and evidence found at the scene, the authorities were able to confirm that the victim was Joanna Yates. With this discovery, the case evolved from a missing person inquiry to a criminal investigation focused on finding the responsible party. The priority for law enforcement shifted to locating and apprehending whoever had taken Joanna's life. Given the complexity of the case and the public attention it had garnered, experienced investigators from across the region, some with backgrounds in major crime investigations, were assigned to assist. A coordinated task force was established to explore every possible angle and to ensure that no detail would be overlooked. Media coverage intensified, but police remained cautious, choosing to release information strategically to avoid jeopardizing the investigation. They appealed to the public for tips and asked local residents to report anything unusual they may have noticed in the days around Joanna's disappearance. Despite interviews with neighbors, no one reported hearing strange sounds or seeing anything out of the ordinary. The lack of eyewitnesses complicated the search for answers, but investigators were determined. One area of particular interest was the building in which Joanna lived. As part of a routine canvassing of nearby residents, officers spoke with everyone in the surrounding apartments. It was during this process that they turned their attention to another tenant in the building, Vincent Tabak, a 32-year-old engineer who shared one of the ground floor units with his partner, 28-year-old Tanya. Tanya had spent that particular Friday night attending a corporate holiday celebration hosted by her employer. Vincent, Tanya's partner, stated that he had stayed home that night. According to him, he spent the evening resting and hadn't planned to leave the apartment until he received a call from Tanya asking for a ride. He picked her up around 2 a.m., several hours after Joanna was last seen. In his initial statement to the police, Vincent downplayed any connection to his neighbors. He claimed he barely knew Joanna or Greg, stating that while he had occasionally seen them in passing and exchanged brief pleasantries, there had never been any substantial interaction between them. Across the street from the building Joanna and Greg lived in, a separate gathering was also taking place. A group of young people had organized a house party that Friday night, inviting numerous friends to what became a lively event with loud music, laughter, and general commotion. According to several attendees interviewed by detectives, many of them had been drinking and were focused entirely on the party atmosphere, paying little attention to what was happening beyond the property. However, a few guests who stepped out onto the balcony around 9:30 p.m. to smoke recalled hearing something strange. While they couldn't agree on the exact nature of the sound, they collectively remembered hearing what seemed like a woman's scream. At the time, it hadn't stood out. It could have been anything, a loud conversation, or even a prank. But in hindsight, that moment became an important timestamp in the timeline investigators were assembling. As detectives worked to identify everyone connected to Joanna's life and surroundings, one person naturally drew attention: Christopher Jeff, the 63-year-old landlord of the building. Jeff was a retired schoolteacher known to most of his tenants as a quiet and reclusive figure. He lived on the upper floor of the house and had owned the property for years. While neighbors described him as eccentric, there was nothing about him that had ever raised concerns prior to Joanna's disappearance. Nonetheless, as part of routine procedure, the police interviewed Jeff multiple times. During a second round of questioning, they noted a subtle shift in his demeanor. He seemed more uneasy and distracted than before, although he remained cooperative and willingly answered all their questions. Jeff stated that on the night in question, he had followed his usual schedule, attending a workout session at a local gym, which he frequented several times per week. According to him, he returned home around 9 p.m., locked his door, and went to bed not long afterward. He emphasized that he neither saw nor heard anything unusual that evening. However, when detectives asked for more detail, Jeff suddenly recalled something he hadn't mentioned in his previous interview. As he was walking home from the gym, he said he had noticed 3 young men loitering near the front of the house. He described them as unfamiliar, noting that he had never seen them in the area before. At the time, he hadn't given it much thought, but given the circumstances, he now considered it potentially relevant. Meanwhile, Vincent Tabak offered a slightly different timeline when asked to recall the events of that Friday. He told detectives that he had actually left the house twice that evening. Once shortly after 9 p.m. to run a brief errand at a local shop, and again at around 2 a.m. to pick up Tanya from her company's party. According to Tabak, when he first stepped outside around 9 o'clock, he noticed that Jeff's vehicle was parked in the driveway in its usual position. But when he returned with Tanya several hours later, the vehicle was still in the driveway, only now it was parked facing the opposite direction. This subtle but telling detail suggested that Jeff's car had been moved during the period he claimed to have been asleep, contradicting his earlier statement to police. Adding another layer to the puzzle, Greg Reardon recalled a brief interaction he had with Jeff earlier that same day, before leaving town for the weekend. Greg had informed Jeff that he would be away visiting family in Sheffield, and mentioned, perhaps casually, perhaps with slight concern, that Joanna would be home alone for the next few days. This moment, in hindsight, carried far more weight. It meant Jeff was fully aware that Joanna would be by herself in the apartment that evening, a fact that led police to scrutinize his movements more closely. On December 30th, nearly 2 weeks after Joanna was last seen, Christopher Jeff was arrested. A full search of his apartment and personal belongings was conducted. Despite his visible discomfort during questioning, Jeff continued to assert his innocence and insisted that he had no knowledge of or involvement in what had happened to Joanna. During the search, officers collected several items of interest, including a pair of shoes with faint brown stains on them. These were sent to a laboratory for forensic testing. Investigators also collected a DNA sample from Jeff for comparison against evidence obtained during the post-discovery analysis of Joanna's clothing and belongings. After a detailed analysis, results revealed that the brown stains on the shoes were not blood or any other biologically significant material. They were, in fact, simple surface dirt. More importantly, the DNA sample from Jeff did not match any of the genetic traces found on Joanna. With no physical evidence connecting him to the crime, and after extensive investigation, Jeff was officially cleared as a suspect and released from custody. The focus of the case now shifted dramatically. With Jeff ruled out, detectives began looking more closely at Vincent Tabak, who until this point had been considered only a witness or peripheral figure. Unlike Jeff, Tabak's movements on the night in question weren't independently verified. Furthermore, certain details he had provided in his earlier statements did not hold up under closer scrutiny. Investigators began to notice that Tabak had subtly attempted to redirect attention toward Jeff on multiple occasions, often offering unsolicited theories about his landlord's behavior. Then came a more concerning observation. When Tabak was brought in for formal questioning, detectives noticed what appeared to be a series of small, faint scratches on the side of his neck, injuries that looked consistent with light defensive contact. When asked how he had sustained them, Tabak gave an explanation that was vague and unsatisfactory. He claimed they were from working around the house, but did not elaborate. When asked again about his neighbors, Tabak repeated his earlier claim that he didn't know them well. He maintained that he and Joanna had never interacted beyond a casual hello, and that their paths rarely crossed due to their respective schedules. The turning point came when detectives requested a DNA sample from Tabak for comparison. He became visibly uneasy, hesitating before responding. Eventually, he agreed to provide the sample, but with an unusual caveat. He stated that he may have inadvertently entered Greg and Joanna's apartment at some point when they weren't home. According to him, he had mistakenly wandered into the wrong unit while it was unoccupied. Despite initial resistance, authorities lawfully obtained a DNA sample from Vincent Tabak. The lab report revealed a partial match between Tabak's DNA and biological material recovered from Joanna Yates's clothing. This revelation eliminated any lingering doubts about his status in the case. On January 11, 2011, law enforcement moved decisively. Tabak was placed under arrest and taken into custody for questioning. In addition to the DNA evidence, technicians identified microscopic fibers within the vehicle and in Tabak's apartment that matched the composition and coloration of the shirt Joanna had been wearing the night she disappeared. These threads further supported the theory that an encounter, far beyond accidental, had taken place between the two inside or near Tabak's environment. With this mounting body of evidence, prosecutors acted swiftly. 2 days after his arrest, on January 13th, Vincent Tabak was formally charged with first-degree homicide. The charges were filed based on physical evidence, contradictions in his previous statements, and behavioral indicators noted during interviews. Over the following weeks, detectives constructed what they believed to be the true sequence of events. According to their theory, Vincent Tabak had developed a persistent and unhealthy fascination with Joanna Yates. He had likely observed her patterns over time and may have been aware of her routines. On the morning of December 17th, when he overheard Greg Reardon mention to the landlord that he would be out of town for the weekend and that Joanna would be alone, Tabak may have seen an opportunity. Later that evening, once he saw Joanna return home, Tabak allegedly approached her under false pretenses, perhaps to ask for help, borrow something, or make casual conversation. Investigators believe he gained her trust momentarily, enough for her to let him inside. What happened next, they argue, was not an accident, but a deliberate and calculated assault. In October 2011, after months of pre-trial proceedings and ongoing forensic analysis, Vincent Tabak's trial officially began. On October 28, 2011, the jury returned a verdict. Vincent Tabak was found guilty of first-degree homicide. The judge, citing the manipulative and calculated nature of the crime, issued a sentence of life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole only after serving a minimum of 20 years.